Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the C-Bus Paranormal Paracast. I'm your host, Johnathon Robson, and on today's episode, I'm going to be discussing a topic that a lot of people have asked me about over the years, the 1912 Dresden, Ohio train wreck. If you've listened to the Prospect Place Mansion episodes in our archive, you know that I've briefly touched on this in the past. But on today's episode, I want to be getting more in depth, and I'll be providing quite a bit of new information and details about the wreck itself, including the location of the crash site. Obviously, I think it's important that we focus on the facts and history of this tragic event, and not on the theatrics and misinformation that was aired by Ghost Adventures on the Travel Channel during their Prospect Place Mansion episode. So if you're one of the few people out there that still believe the victims of the wreck were brought to the mansion because Zach said so, well, you're going to be severely disappointed. When I was one of the owners of Prospect Place, I'd constantly get questions about this train wreck. I would try to answer everybody's questions to the best of my ability at that time. Now that I've had time to do a massive deep dive into the newspaper archives and the crash records, I have a lot of new information to bring to the table for all of you. So today, my hope is to bring closure to the stories of the victims of this tragedy, and to also set the record straight once and for all on what happened that fateful night. These poor souls all lived interesting lives, and they deserve to be remembered with dignity and respect, and I'll do what I can to present their stories accordingly. However, the gruesome details and the eyewitness reports of this tragedy will be read as they were originally reported. Before we begin, I would like to talk about next month's episode of the Paracast, as it'll be our first Q&A episode, so get your questions ready, and I'll do the best that I can to answer all of your questions. If you have any questions about past episodes, certain locations, equipment, paranormal topics, or anything else related to the show, feel free to ask your questions on our social media pages or through our website's contact form on cbusparanormal.com. This is your chance to be heard, so please take advantage of it. With that being said, it's time to get into today's story and explore the historic and horrific details of the 1912 Dresden, Ohio train wreck. Our story begins on December 3rd, 1912. It seemed just like any other day on the surface, but this date would soon live in infamy for an event that would transpire later that evening. Daisy Emerson and her family were already getting into the year's holiday festivities, while her husband Albert Emerson was out of town working as a successful traveling salesman. A few weeks prior, Daisy's father, Jacob Berge, would travel down to Zanesville to help his daughter with the grandkids and to also celebrate Thanksgiving together. Daisy and Albert were married in December of 1908, and the Times-Recorder newspaper gave quite a write-up of the affair. Daisy was described as being a musician of unusual ability, and was an organist for the First Baptist Church, South Street Church, and the Alucott Avenue Church. The paper also mentioned that the couple would be leaving for a 2-week tour of the West for their honeymoon, and that they would be spending a considerable amount of time in Illinois. In the 3 years since the wedding, the Emerson family would welcome 2 children into their family named Elizabeth and William. Sadly, in a few hours, their entire family would never be the same again. The Emerson family had been traveling on December 3rd, 1912, and they boarded the Cleveland, Akron, and Columbus passenger train that was heading to Zanesville, just like they had done several times before. But unfortunately, this ride would have a much different ending. The following day, the Times-Recorder newspaper would print an article that would paint a tragic and horrific first-hand encounter of this event, and to this day it's still the most informative and cited newspaper article on the subject. The following is from the Times-Recorder newspaper on December 4th, 1912. Many killed in rear-end collision of passenger trains at Dresden. 8 dead, 4 dying, others injured, all frightfully mangled and scalded. Express train stopped by dead engine. Onrushing local plows through coach strewing victims. Trains were running but 3 minutes apart, and brakemen did not have time to flag the approaching death demon. All over in a moment. Awful scenes meet the eyes of rescuers. Wailing cries pierce the night air, and strong men turn away their faces as they work with bare hands to relieve the suffering. 8 are dead and injured, 4 of whom will probably die as a result of the most tragic railroad wreck in the history of the vicinity of Zanesville, when 2 passenger trains came together in an awful rear-end collision 14 miles east of Zanesville on the Pennsylvania lines at 6 o'clock Tuesday night. The dead and dying were horribly crushed and scalded, and the wailing of the tortured pierced the cold night air when first rescuers arrived on the terrible scene. All of the dead and injured were in the rear coach of number 125, the Cleveland Express, into which the number 43 black steaming locomotive plowed at high speed. The impact was terrible, number 125 having stopped with its engine dead on the tracks. The engine of the second train tore the coach ahead into two halves, crushing and mangling the occupants who were caught like rats in a trap, and after the worst seemed accomplished, escaping steam rendered death a blessing unto the other victims. 4 of the victims were killed instantly. At 11:25 o'clock last night, the death list was increased to 8 when 4 victims who had been taken to the hospitals succumbed to their frightful injuries after untold suffering. Henry Balbion, Dresden manager of the Cleveland woolen mills at Dresden, died at Bethesda Hospital at 10:45 o'clock. Max Harris, Lodi, died at Good Samaritan Hospital at 10:25 o'clock. L.H. Blaney, brakeman, died at the Bethesda Hospital at 11 o'clock. And Henry Bartels, age 30, Albion, Michigan, died at 11:25 at Good Samaritan Hospital. The engine of the Cleveland Express on the Cleveland division of the Pennsylvania line was disabled and running at slow speed when it was reported that a plug blew out, leaving the engine dead on the tracks. Running at a high speed just 3 minutes behind was the train number 43 of the Pennsylvania from Trainwreck, bound for Lancaster. With the disabling of the express, a flagman was ordered out to bring the fast-approaching local to a stop, but the flagman carrying a warning signal had only moved up the tracks a few hundred yards when the local showed in sight around a curve at full speed. The engineer failed to distinguish the warning signal, and in another moment the rear coach of the express was piled high over the top of the local engine, while inside that fatal car, men and women and children were bruised, burned, bleeding, and dying. A handful of strong men on the rear platform of the ill-fated car had left their seats to learn the cause of the train stopping at that point. They were chattering in a carefree manner when the headlight of the fast-approaching engine appeared around the curve, bearing down upon them. Realizing their danger, they leaped to safety and were present for the thrilling scenes that followed. The passenger car was telescoped by the powerful engine. The engine plowed through the center of the car, and it was thrown upon the top of the engine itself. The ill-fated car extended from the pilot to the tender, and was still in this position when the rescue train arrived on the scene an hour later. Pinioned between the roof of the car and over the hot boiler of the engine, those severely injured were left in a helpless condition, with escaping steam from the engine burning their scarred faces. The flesh on the faces of several were literally cooked with steam. The hands and arms of others were terribly burned. It was almost hopeless to escape from that wrecked interior through the clouds of escaping steam and the smoke from the engine. Passengers from the safe cars responded to the call of the suffering, and the work of rescuing the dead and injured began at once. They were carried from the ill-fated car and placed on improvised cots made from cushions from the cars. The rescuers faced a situation that paled the most strong-hearted. The cries of strong men mingled with those of women and the pitying appeals of children. The odors of burning flesh filled the car and added another torture to the work. Groping about on the hot boiler of that engine, rescuers found men and women slowly cooking to death in steam or over the heated boiler of the engine. The scene beggars description. The pathetic appeal of a mother for her children was heard, and then it was silence. Soon the rescuers carried the lifeless form of the woman from the car, and soon was added the forms of 2 little children. The little bodies were laid side by side upon the grass, their heads resting on a cushion. Strong men threw off their coats despite the cool night air, that those little bodies might be covered from view. I'll stop there for a moment. As you heard and probably guessed, the woman in the article would turn out to be Daisy Emerson, and the 2 children were William and Elizabeth. They would all unfortunately perish at the scene of the wreck. In just 4 years, the new Emerson family went from living their new hopes and dreams to pure devastation. I'm sure you can imagine the absolute shock Albert Emerson experienced when he picked up the newspaper the following morning and learned that his entire family was gone in an instant. He stated he read the article multiple times in disbelief, and he had an extremely hard time coming to terms with his new reality. The 4th person that died at the scene would be Henry Haskell, who was a traveling salesman from Ellicott Avenue. At the time, he didn't have any identifying paper on his body. but a letter was later found in the pocket from his employer, which would eventually lead to the positive identification. He was also apparently carrying a pocket watch that had stopped at the point of impact, 5:59 o'clock. For those of you that haven't listened to our previous episodes on Prospect Place Mansion, I might as well briefly cover the ghost adventure situation. During the episode, Zach Baggins was sitting down with the former owner and alleged family member Jeff Adams, who mentioned the train was heading to Mount Vernon at the time, which it obviously wasn't. And he also made the claim that the victims and injured were taken to the Prospect Place Mansion basement in what was considered to be a field hospital type setup. In reality, these poor souls were never taken to the mansion, and I was able to use my findings in this newspaper article to set the record straight a few years later. The crash site itself was turned into a makeshift field hospital at the time of the wreck. This is just one of many reasons why these entertainment television shows can't be taken seriously. Let us continue. After the work of the rescue was underway, bonfires were built around the track to illuminate the scene and provide warmth for those that escaped. The dead bodies and injured were placed beside these fires while the physicians applied emergency remedies. Soon after the report of the wreck reached here, a special train was made ready and officials of the railroad, together with surgeons and ambulance men with cots, were hurried to the scene. The baggage car was filled with cots for the injured and baskets for the dead. All the local undertaking firms had been notified of the wreck and were asked to send ambulances to the depot. These men and all their paraphernalia were taken along. A Times Recorder reporter passed among the burned, scarred, and the bleeding men and women in an effort to learn their identity. Some struggled vainly to tell their names, their tongues and lips swollen so badly it was impossible for them to utter a perceptible sound. Others braced themselves against their cots and freely told their names and addresses. The cries and moans continued until Zanesville was reached, when the injured were removed and hurried to the hospitals. Lester Donnelly of Greenwood Avenue was in the smoker of the Cincinnati and Muskingum Valley passenger train, and he tells the following of the smash-up. The Cleveland, Akron, and Columbus train left Trainwreck at about 5:27, as nearly as I can recollect, and the Cincinnati Muskingum Valley train upon which I rode left 3 minutes later. The Cleveland, Akron, and Columbus had stopped near Rock Cut and sent out a flagman, but our train was too close to stop. The engineer jammed on the air brakes, and then he and the fireman jumped. Harry Roush and myself and a number of other passengers in the rear end of the smoker were thrown across the floor, but none of us were hurt. We jumped out as quickly as we could and started the work of the rescue. 3 other passengers traveling on the rear train corroborated Donnelly's story. They claim that the Cincinnati and Muskingum Valley train left Trainwreck 3 minutes after the Cleveland, Akron, and Columbus train, instead of 10 minutes as usual. A delegation of passengers visited the Times Recorder office last night and made the statement. They also stated that the flagman did get back far enough, but that the fireman was shoveling coal into the firebox and the flagman was on his side of the track, hence the inability of the engineer to see the danger signal. So as you just heard, there was already conflicting stories on who was to blame for the wreck and what they possibly could have done to prevent it. We'll come back to that later in the episode. Donnelly also mentioned that the passenger train had broke down near Rock Cut, which is a clue to the location of the crash site. The rest of the newspaper article would provide several important details of what happened during and after the train wreck. The Dresden physicians were the first on the scene after they used a hand cart to get to the crash site. And during the work of the rescue, the survivors of the wreck were able to get the broken down locomotive back into operation, and they were able to get the train to Ellis Station a bit further down the track. The following is a first-hand account from one of the passengers awaiting his train to arrive at Ellis Station. Lewis Dixon, a well-known local businessman, was waiting in the Ellis Station for a train to Zanesville when a section of the wrecked train arrived with news of the accident. He was a member of the relief party, which immediately went back to the scene of the accident. The confusion was indescribable, said Dixon. The darkness added to the horror of the situation. A deep gully which was beside the track made the work of the rescue harder. The rear coach of the front train was almost completely cut in 2 parts by the engine of the second train, but strangely enough didn't leave the tracks. The wrecked car formed a snug bed for the engine. We were hindered in the work by suffocating smoke from the engine. The smokestack of the engine was knocked off in the collision. Dense clouds of smoke rolled from the heavy bowels of the engine into the faces of the rescuers, who were also working in close contact with the boiler, under which was still a fire. We worked carefully to prevent a fire from starting in the debris and used relays of workers. As the smoke drove one set of rescuers away from the work, another party would take their place. We worked feverishly, digging into the debris with our fingers, axes, hatchets, and boards, and anything else at hand that would serve our purpose. I shall never forget my sensations. Just as we thought there were no more bodies to be found, and were about to give up the work, the body of a man was discovered on top of the desperately hot boiler. One of his legs was horribly cut and mangled, and his stomach and bowels were cut open, allowing his entrails to steam out. Had he not been killed in the impact of the collision, he would have literally cooked to death. The body of Miss Emerson we found with the head forced through a window. After lifting it, we found the 2 little children beneath her. It was my opinion that there were other bodies in that wreck, but the railroad authorities claimed they had every person aboard in the train accounted for. As we answered the heart-rending cries for aid of the injured people, I saw sights that I will never forget. I lifted the head of a girl to give her a drink of water and saw a deep gash in her face. The flesh was laid open and her hair was matted with blood. It was sickening. Dr. E.H. Collender was one of the first to the rescue. He stated, "I will never forget the wreck scene to my dying day. The injured were lying alongside the track, some of them on mail sacks. We got some warm water from the engine and bathed their wounds. Some of them begged for morphine to ease their pain, and some was administered. All of the victims were conscious and were suffering intensely. One lad was calling out for his mother in agonizing tones, and another told me he was engaged to be married, in a piteous voice, when he asked me if he would get well. That man was Max Harris. He asked in the hospital later that evening if his time had come. He then stated that he was engaged to a little girl down in Kansas, and that he wanted the doctors to notify her. These were the last words he would ever say." Shortly after the wrecked train arrived at Ellis Station, a rescue train would be sent from Zanesville. From there, a large crowd of family members and bystanders would await for its arrival to the depot. The crowd was estimated to be around 1,000 people, and the Times Recorder was just as busy as several hundred people were standing outside of their bulletin window, awaiting word on the family and friends that were involved with the wreck. Daisy Emerson's sister Florence, a Zanesville schoolteacher, would be one of the family members awaiting at the depot. On the way to the depot, she seen the increased traffic and learned about the wreck from the commotion of the crowd. Once the rescue train arrived, she couldn't locate her family. Florence, hoping that her family was spared, asked a train official if Miss Emerson and the kids were on the train. Unfortunately, the train officials didn't have access to the names of the deceased at that time. She then asked around the crowd, trying to find out if a woman and her 2 children were killed, when a woman told her that a woman and her 2 children were taken to a local undertaking establishment. Florence immediately broke down amongst the crowd, and as she was sent to the local undertaker firms to identify the bodies. Unfortunately, she also had no idea that her father would be joining them in death a few hours later. Jacob Berge was also fatally scalded in a wreck, and he was taken to Good Samaritan Hospital. At the time, Florence was unaware that her father was also on the train, and found out after the fact. She arrived at the hospital while her father was already in an unconscious state, and was with him when he passed. At the time of this newspaper article, 8 people had died: Daisy Emerson, her 2 children, Henry Balbion, Max Harris, L.H. Blaney, and Henry Bartles. There were also 4 individuals listed as seriously injured: Jacob Berge, who we previously discussed, passed shortly after, Wilbur Ludwig, Nellie Taylor, and James Bryant, the engineer for the Cincinnati and Muskingum Valley train, who leaped from the train before impact. James would be the only one to survive from the remaining seriously injured. In total, there were 11 deaths from this disaster. Apparently, in another bad omen of what was to come, an undertaker's horse that belonged to Kelly and Company also dropped dead while they were waiting for the arrival of the relief train. Now that I've discussed the wreck in detail, it's time to look deeper into the newspaper archives, the public records, the aftermath of the wreck, and the location itself, after the short break. Paranormal investigators, it's time to start planning for your upcoming investigations and to also stock up on new ghost hunting devices. Thankfully, GhostStop has you covered. GhostStop has everything you need to advance your team's research and theories. They have digital recorders, camcorders, thermal imagers, EMF devices, laser grids, and much, much more. If you need it, they likely have it. Our team has used several GhostStop products over the years. Click the GhostStop link on this episode's information panel or on our website at cbusparanormal.com, and you can browse through their extensive catalog and place your order today. By using the show's affiliate link on our player and website, you'll also be supporting our show, and this lets GhostStop know that we sent you. GhostStop, paranormal equipment made by investigators for investigators. Welcome back. The information that I just covered is the most well-known information about the train wreck, and most people seem to stop researching it after the first newspaper article. But lo and behold, there were many more newspaper articles about it in the weeks and months afterwards. I'm going to pick back up our story on the following day, the Times-Recorder newspaper, December 5th, 1912 edition, which ironically, right on the front page features a photo of the wreck that I had previously never seen before, and it gives an interesting look at the crash site the following day. I find it odd that this photo is nowhere to be found on the internet, and I've never heard anybody else talk about it. It's truly remarkable, and I'm stunned that I've never seen it before. I'll be sharing this photo online in the next few days, and it will also likely appear in our upcoming bonus content videos for this episode on TikTok and YouTube, so stay tuned. Usually wreck researchers want to debate about the photo that was shown on Ghost Adventures, which due to the circumstances, I'd rather not talk about. But long story short, Holocaust deniers have tried to use this photo as evidence of propaganda. A quick Google search will lead you to this entire debacle, and quite frankly, it's not worth discussing on this month's show. I have enough valid material to work with that I don't need to dabble in propaganda or Holocaust denier theories. Let's just say the photo that the show used was highly controversial, and I've not seen any proof that it actually came from the 1912 train wreck itself. So let's move on, not disrespect the deceased, and get to some of the more important pieces of this next article. Funeral cars and ambulances on the city streets are mute evidence to remind people of the catastrophe. 4 silent hearses of the dead bear victims of the Emerson family to the saddened home, as people on their way dash away the tears. In Zanesville, early Wednesday evening, a procession of 4 cars carrying wreck victims moved west on Main Street. Inside these vehicles were the bodies of Jacob Berge, his daughter Daisy Emerson, and her 2 children, Elizabeth and William Emerson. Slowly, this procession moved along the street to the Emerson home, where the 4 caskets were placed in one room of the home. 3 official investigations are already underway as a result of the tragic rear-end collision of passenger trains on the Pennsylvania lines near Dresden early Tuesday, when 11 persons lost their lives and a number of others were injured. Each of the 3 investigation bodies will proceed on different lines to endeavor to learn the exact cause of the accident and place the blame for the tragic affair. These investigations are to be conducted by Dr. A.E. Walters, coroner of the Muskingum County, by John Sullivan of the State Public Service Commission, and by officials of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Each investigation will be conducted independently of the other. Shreds of burned flesh, a child's hand, and a finger were among the ghastly finds of curious sight-seekers at the scene of the Pennsylvania wreck at dawn Wednesday morning, after the heavy coach had been lifted by the wrecking crew and thrown top-down in a ditch at the side of the right-of-way. Among the remaining debris upon the track, which had been gathered in a small pile, were many bits of flesh from the victims. In the darkness of the tragic night, these ghastly reminders of the disaster that cost 11 lives were missed. The object was to get the injured and dying to Zanesville and into the hospitals at the earliest possible moment. It was for the morning to reveal many bits of the recent happy persons who lost their lives in the twinkling of an eye. I can only imagine the grief in what was left of these poor families and the community at the time. At this point, the passenger car was unceremoniously dumped off in a ditch on the left side of the tracks, and the railroad worked to get the train back in operation as quickly as possible, almost like nothing ever happened. Apparently, the tracks were cleared by noon the following day. The paper also reports that the debris was still scattered along the tracks, and pools of blood and pieces of flesh from the dying were still visible on the side of the track, as well as their suitcases and their contents that were still scattered over the ground while the cleanup continued. During my research, I also learned that both trains had cars attached to them, and that they were all made of wood, which also explains how the Cincinnati and Muskingum Valley train caused so much damage upon impact. When the train's engineer, James Bryant, slammed on the brakes, the cars detached from the speeding locomotive as it sailed into the doomed Cleveland, Akron, and Columbus passenger car. As a result, the doomed Cleveland, Akron, and Columbus train cars were also detached from the first locomotive upon impact, but it didn't go off the track. Despite being reported in grave condition in the original article, the engineer of the Cincinnati and Muskingum Valley train, James Bryant, survived and appeared to be suffering from severe sprains and bruises. James and his fireman, Frank Sopp, had jumped out of the train at the last possible second and rolled out of harm's way. Later, when help had arrived, both trainsmen told rescuers to tend to the others who were more seriously injured. Frank Sopp would end up back to work the following week. Bryant provided an odd quote during one of his interviews, where he briefly mentioned the crash site and also 2 prior victims of some other accident at the same spot. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any more information on these 2 individuals, however. He stated at the point where the wreck happened is one of the bad places in a road, being downgrade and curved at the same time. It was near there that Bob Gray and Eddie Kennan were killed some years ago. So historians and ghost hunters alike, you might want to take note of those 2 names as well for research purposes to see what you might find. A Times Recorder article on February 26, 1913 would give an interesting look at what could have happened to Bryant and Mr. Sopp if they didn't jump out of the train at the last possible second. I'll read from that article now. Engine and wreck, but heap of scrap. Passenger engine number 9713 of the Pennsylvania Railroad, which crashed into the Cleveland, Akron, and Columbus Express train near Dresden in December, about 2.5 months ago, was towed over to the Lancaster shopyards from Zanesville yesterday by freight train. The ill-fated locomotive attracted no little attention. Strange enough, the trucks of the engine were not damaged, but the sides and forepart showed plainly that the locomotive had been in a terrific smash-up. The entire cab was torn away, making it apparent that had engineer James Bryant and his firemen remained in the engine, they would have undoubtedly been crushed to death. The locomotive will probably never be rebuilt, it having been practically reduced to a heap of scrap iron in a wreck. So if you ever wondered what happened to the train, well, the entire cab was torn off, and there wasn't much left of it. I'm not sure what the shopyard did with it after it was towed in. In all of the chaos of the wreck, there was also an unlikely hero, a man we previously heard an eyewitness account from. Lester Donnelly was apparently a prisoner being transported by Constable Roush on the Cincinnati-Muskingum Valley train. When the wreck occurred, Roush lost contact with Donnelly and thought he escaped. However, he was again located assisting the injured and deceased at the crash site. In turn, Lester's court case was quickly settled the following day, and he was able to return to his job. On December 6, 1912, the Times Recorder would write one last article on the Immersed family, as it reported that the bodies of Daisy, her father, and the 2 children would be returned home to Clinton, Ohio for a funeral and burial. Upon the same train, they met their end. When I read that, I honestly became rather angry at the irony. To me, it felt extremely disrespectful to the family to bring their loved ones to their grave sites with the same engine that failed them days before. After everything they went through in their final moments, ultimately to be sent to their grave sites a few days later on the same locomotive that caused their deaths. I'm sure the immediate family was furious. I was able to take a trip to the small church and cemetery where the Emersons and Mr. Berge were buried and paid my respects. They had the biggest monument in the graveyard, and it stands as a tragic reminder of this entire horrific event. I'll be sharing not only the photos of the wreck from the Times Recorder, but also various photos of the deceased that I could find, and also photos of the cemetery itself. So keep an eye out on social media and our bonus content channels on YouTube and TikTok, in the near future for updates. In the following weeks, the survivors and rescuers involved with the train wreck would go through rigorous questioning to try to determine who was at fault for the disaster. And it's really no surprise that there was plenty of blame to go around. So who was really to blame for this tragedy? If you've heard about the wreck previously, you've likely heard that the brakeman was at fault for not being able to flag the second train in time. But was that really the case? After scouring the official wreck reports, it seems that that is also partially inaccurate. In March of 1913, the Interstate Commerce Commission completed their investigation into the incident and found that the Cleveland, Akron, and Columbus Division of the Pennsylvania Railroad was at fault for the wreck. The following is from the March 10, 1913 edition of the Times Recorder. Official finding of Interstate Commission holds employees and railroad jointly for wreck. Engineer Bryant of the Cincinnati and Muskingum Valley train and conductor Sapp and flagman Kuhn share in cause of Dresden wreck, December 3, 1912, according to official report received yesterday. The Pennsylvania Railroad Company is blamed for the Dresden wreck December 3rd for running its trains too closely together and failing to maintain proper repairs on the Cleveland, Akron, and Columbus train after the repairs had been reported. Flagman Kuhn is blamed for failing to carry fuses with him when he went out to flag the Cincinnati and Muskingum Valley train, and for failing to have them handy in the rear coach of his train for emergencies. Conductor Sapp of the Cleveland, Akron, and Columbus train is blamed for not seeing that Kuhn had the fuses handy. Engineer Bryant of the Cincinnati and Muskingum Valley train is blamed for running his train faster than the rules allowed. These are the official findings of the Interstate Commission in its investigation of the Dresden wreck, copies of which reached Zanesville yesterday. The report is that rendered by H.W. Belknap, Chief Inspector of Safety Appliances of the Commission, while directing the investigation into the disaster which caused the death of 9 passengers and 2 trainmen last December 3rd near Dresden. Inspector Belknap's official report is as follows. Westbound passenger train number 125 consisted of 1 combination mail and baggage and express car and 1 coach, both of wooden construction, hauled by engine 9828. The train was in charge of conductor Sapp and engineer Zyloff. It left Trainwreck, Ohio at 5:40 p.m., 22 minutes behind its scheduled time, and left Dresden at 5:49 p.m., 27 minutes late. At 5:55 p.m., when 3.5 miles west of Dresden, the train was brought to a stop as the braking pipe which supplies the air whistle signal with air from the main air drum broke and caused the air brakes to be applied. While repairs were being made by the engine crew, the rear end of the train was struck by the Cincinnati and Muskingum Valley train. Westbound passenger train Cincinnati and Muskingum Valley consisted of 1 combination mail, baggage, and express car, and 2 coaches, all of wooden construction hauled by engine 9713. It was in charge of conductor Evans and engineman Bryant. This train left Trainwreck at 5:47 p.m., being 5 minutes late, and left Dresden at 5:54, 8 minutes late, and 5 minutes behind train number 125. The engine of the Cincinnati and Muskingum Valley train telescoped the coach on the Cleveland, Akron, and Columbus train for about 2/3 of its length. All of those killed were in this car. The Cincinnati and Muskingum Valley engine was considerably damaged, while both baggage cars were slightly damaged. None of the trucks were derailed under any of the cars or under the engine. It is estimated that the train was driven ahead 200 or 300 feet by the force of the collision. That's important, and I'll come back to it. The Zanesville division of the Pennsylvania lines on which the accident occurred is a single-track line. No block system is in operation. Under Rules Number 91, trains running in the same direction are spaced 5 minutes apart, except when closing up at stations. The accident occurred about 350 feet west of a 2-degree curve, 1,371 feet in length. Approaching this curve from the east, the track is straight for about 3/4 of a mile. This straight track is on a descending grade for westbound trains. From the beginning of the curve to some distance beyond where the accident happened, the track is practically level. In the vicinity of the point of the accident, the track is in a cut about 300 feet long. The walls of this cut are about 6 feet high on the south side and 12 feet high on the north side. The view farther east is obscured by trees. At the time of the accident, it was dark and clear. And there you have it, the only known details of the crash site. We'll explore this further in the next segment. The investigation of this incident disclosed the fact that the Cleveland, Akron, and Columbus train, when running at the speed of 45 to 50 miles per hour, was brought to a stop by the breaking of the pipe supplying air to the air whistle signal. This pipe had been reported on the preceding night as needing repairs. Nothing was done, however, on the account of the necessary material to make the repairs not being available, and the engine was sent out on its run in a defective condition. Wow. How about that for some lesser-known details? The estimates of the employees as to how long the train had been stopped prior to the collision varied from 3 to 5 minutes. As soon as the train came to a stop, the flagman started back with lanterns and torpedoes to protect his train, walking part of the time and part of the time running. He had probably reached a point of 1,000 to 1,200 feet to the rear of the train when he was passed by the Cincinnati and Muskingum Valley train. The engineman of that train could see him, but a short distance on account of being on the outside of the curve. The fireman could have seen the markers of the train ahead at a distance of about 1,500 feet, had he been looking out the side of his engine, but it appears that he had been putting fire in and had just finished his work when the engineman applied the brakes. The speed of the Cincinnati and Muskingum Valley train prior to the application of the brakes was estimated to be about 55 miles per hour. The engineman stated that when he saw the flagman, he at once made a 10-pound reduction. Immediately afterwards, he saw the markers of the Cleveland, Akron, and Columbus train, place the brake valve in the emergency position, and reverse the engine. According to the time card rule, the speed of the trains over this portion of the road is limited to 40 miles per hour. From the testimony of the crews and the trains here involved, it appears that both exceeded the speed limit, and that the speeds attained were not unusual. All the employees involved were experienced men with good records, and none had been on duty in violation of the provisions of the hours of service law. So as you've heard, there were already many faults being called out by the safety inspector. And here's where the hammer comes down, so to speak. The inspector went on to blame Flagman Kuhn for his inability to get back a significant distance to flag the oncoming Cincinnati and Muskingum Valley train. He states Kuhn did what he could, but violated Rule 99A that states when protecting a train that a fuse must be used when the conditions require it. Kuhn kept his fuses in the smoking compartment of the coach, instead of having them at the rear end of the car where they could have been readily available. In turn, conductor Sapp of the Cleveland, Akron, and Columbus train was also at fault for not supervising and seeing to it that Kuhn had all of his stop signals ready in case of an emergency. Engineman Davis of the Cleveland, Akron, and Columbus train was also at fault for not obeying the time card rule, limiting the speed of the train. Had he observed this rule, it would have put him in a position for the train to come to a stop faster at the time of the pipe break. This, of course, is in addition to the previously mentioned speed violation of the Cincinnati and Muskingum Valley train, and the lack of well-known, needed, and ignored maintenance of the Cleveland, Akron, and Columbus train. Unbelievable. The finding of the Interstate Commission apparently lifted some of the blame for the terrible accident from brakeman Kuhn, who ran back to flag the Cincinnati and Muskingum Valley train, and who failed to get back far enough to avert the collision. Kuhn stated he did not have enough time to run back far enough, and the witnesses say that he hurried as fast as he could up the tracks toward the approaching local. The Interstate Commission seems to have taken Kuhn's story of the tragedy as truth, although Kuhn was discharged by the Pennsylvania Railroad Company, aka fired, which placed the blame for the accident upon his shoulders, which is ironic considering they neglected their duty of the time between the trains and didn't maintenance the train that they knew needed to be maintenanced the night before. Apparently they decided Kuhn was going to be their fall guy by all means necessary, and fired him, long before this investigation was actually completed. Coroner A.E. Walters was pleased with the Interstate Commission's findings, and it sustained his decision. The coroner decided that the cause of the wreck lay in the carelessness of the railroad in permitting the trains to run at too close of intervals. Testimony at the inquest showed that the trains left Dresden less than 5 minutes apart, and the coroner in his decision stated that 5 minutes is not enough between the trains from a safety standpoint. The coroner's verdict exonerated brakeman Kuhn, as it was stated he did his duty as a flagman, but that his signals were not seen in time. So if you've heard over the years that the brakeman was at fault for this event, well, it seems there was plenty of blame to go around. While his attempt to stop the oncoming train wasn't perfect, it's clear the incident could have been avoided had the Pennsylvania Railroad actually did their part in keeping the trains safe. So that concludes the results of the official investigation of the 1912 Dresden train wreck. Now let's take a look at the paranormal claims and investigations of the wreck. Over the years, I've seen a few videos pop up from teams trying to conduct their own investigation of the crash site, except for the fact that they were nowhere near it. Some teams have also claimed to get EVPs from the Prospect Place barn and basement related to the train wreck over the years. But as we've seen and discussed, their information turned out to be completely and factually inaccurate. They seen the wreck covered on Ghost Adventures, didn't do any actual research, and blindly followed the information that was aired. So where is the crash site? And does it have paranormal activity? Well, I've located the site, and might even have a piece of the wreckage from the debris field itself. Unlike the previous investigators, I knew the key would be to find the railroad line the wreck occurred on, and that I'd have to pull up the wreck's newspaper archives and official investigation notes to try to solve this mystery. As an out-of-towner and being unfamiliar with the old railroad lines, it would take me a little longer to figure out where the railroad line was, and to try to pinpoint the believed crash site. The infamous December 4th, 1912 newspaper article did provide a few clues, and prisoner Lester Donnelly provided some interesting details in his version of what happened at the scene. As he stated, the Cleveland, Akron, and Columbus train had stalled out near Rock Cut Road, which is a few miles outside of Dresden, Ohio. The paper also mentioned the wreck itself was on a curve. After doing some research, I noticed there's still an existing railroad line that runs and curves by Rock Cut Road, and some teams thought that this also might be the crash site area, except they're also in the wrong location. The existing line is still in operation and appears to be part of the Ohio Central Railroad. It became clear that I would need to dig even deeper as to what railroad line the crash occurred on, and then find its location in today's environment. And it wouldn't take me long until I got the answers that I needed. At the time of the wreck, as we discussed, the railroad line was owned by the Pennsylvania Railroad, but it wasn't always owned by them. Ironically, and perhaps finally coming full circle, my research led to the Cincinnati and Muskingum Valley Railroad line, which both the Cleveland, Akron, and Columbus line and the Cincinnati and Muskingum Valley line shared and ran through during this time period. The original builder and owner of this railroad line would be the one and only George W. Adams from Prospect Place Mansion. Any guesses to whose land and railroad line that was built on? You guess it. George W. Adams owned the property that the line ran through near Rock Cut Road, according to the old land maps dating back to 1866. So it made obvious sense that since it was George W. Adams' land and railroad, that ironically the crash site would still have a tie to Prospect Place in some strange way, just not the way it was aired on television. It turns out that the Cincinnati and Muskingum Valley Railroad line was abandoned in the 1970s, and then was discontinued altogether after several mergers over its existence. So that led to my next question. Where did the Cincinnati and Muskingum Valley connect to Rock Cut Road? And where is the curve that was cited so many times in the early newspaper articles? As I looked through Google Maps, I noticed that the Muskingum Recreational Bike Trail ran from Dresden all the way to Rock Cut Road, parallel to the current Ohio Central Railroad. And ironically, I noticed a large curve that connected to Rock Cut Road. And after a little bit more research, my suspicions were confirmed. The Muskingum Recreational Bike Trail is in fact the paved over remains of the Muskingum Valley Railroad. Everything then made sense. The location of the wreck, what happened to the Cincinnati and Muskingum Valley Railroad line, and the train's reported location passing through Ellis on the way to Zanesville originally. This was it. Everything that I was looking for. For those of you that are seeking out the crash site, I recommend pulling up Google Maps. Search for the Muskingum Recreational Bike Trail, and follow the trail's path all the way out of town into Rock Cut Road. From there, you should see a large curve. This is where the wreck ended up after the Cincinnati and Muskingum Valley train hit the Cleveland, Akron, and Columbus train. Just remember that the crash ended near the curve. However, it was pushed 200 to 300 feet due to the force of the impact. That information will at least put you in the right area. I'll be putting together a video for the bonus content video of this episode, so stay tuned to our TikTok and YouTube channels for more information. Local researcher and Prospect Place board member Amy Green and I would drive out the Rock Cut Road on January 1st, 2023. We would start at the far end of the bike trail and walk our way to the curve at the believed crash site location. And it wouldn't take long before we'd find several railroad spikes and pieces of railroad track near the edges of the paved bike trail. It seemed that the workers on the bike path simply pushed parts of the track aside when they did their paving. In turn, there was plenty of evidence of the old Cincinnati and Muskingum Valley Railroad still present, even today. We kept walking, and once we reached the curve, it was pretty obvious that we reached the location in question, the 1912 Trainwreck crash site. It wouldn't take long for me to envision a December 5th newspaper photo of the wreck in today's environment, and I would later take present-day photos in an attempt to match the spot where the passenger car was possibly thrown over the bank during the cleanup of the wreck. This was indeed the crash site. The area has slightly changed over the years, and the land beside the trail that G.W. Adams once owned is now private property. So out of respect to the owners, we both agreed that our research would stay on the trail in question. During our first day of investigation, I documented the crash site and conducted an EVP session to see if anything might be present with us at that time. After reading over the wreck's investigation reports once more, we'd go back to the crash site a few weeks later. At that time, we were armed with new information. After the initial point of impact, the ill-fated Cleveland, Akron, and Columbus train was pushed an additional 200 to 300 feet onto the curve itself. So in all reality, the point of impact was actually before the curve, but ended on it. This would also be confirmed by the wreck investigation reports that confirmed the brakeman did in fact make it past a curve to flag the Cincinnati Muskingum Valley train, but that the second train simply didn't have enough time to stop. If you walk past the big curve from Rock Cut Road and look down the trail toward Dresden, you'll notice a much smaller curve. The track appears to be straight for a long way towards Dresden, but this slight curve would have made it impossible for the second train to see the first until it was right on top of it, which the reports indicated. I believe this is the spot where Brakeman Kuhn was at in the report. After conducting some observations of the area in question, we were able to find a few old pieces of metal that appeared to come from an engine. While I can't be 100% certain this came from the engines in question at the night of the crash, it is very suspicious in its placement and with the history that we're discussing. It's also important to note that these metal pieces were completely different from what we found around the curve, and there's likely a reason for that. The curve area has been well searched over the years. The area was cleaned up after the wreck. The landscape on the left side of the track has changed with property renovations, and everything was disheveled and moved once again when the bike trail was paved and placed where the track used to be located. So naturally, possibly finding a few things a bit higher on the hillside that hadn't been tampered with was a welcome find. Hopefully we'll get these pieces looked at by a professional in the near future. Overall, I ran audio and video at the crash site multiple times, and I also ran audio at the Emerson family plot, and there were no responses or evidence of a haunting during these sessions. While I can't discourage every amateur investigator with a broken radio not to visit the crash site, I do want to be clear that prospective investigators should be respectful to the poor souls that lost their lives on that cold December night. It has taken decades, literally, for the crash site to be found once more, and I hope that with time a memorial might be placed in the area. From what I've read, there are plans to extend the bike path even further in the near future, all the way to Ellis. So hopefully at some point a memorial might become a reality. It's important to note that over the years there have been no reports of a phantom train or ghostly specters being seen in this area, and I'd like to think that this will remain the case. After numerous errors of teams trying to locate the crash site, and of teams spreading nonsensical legends of the crash, perhaps these investigators and paranormal enthusiasts can now take a step back and look at the history of the moment in time for what it was, and not for the over-the-top theatrical and entertainment fraud that it was presented as on television. This episode of the Paracast was made memorial for the victims of the 1912 Dresden train wreck, and in hopes that their stories can now be shared respectfully. So if you intend to investigate the site, I ask that you treat it with the highest amount of respect. Keep the legends out of it, keep questionable evidence to yourselves, and stop spreading rumors of what might have happened, and stick with the facts that are known. I don't think that's a lot to ask for. On December 3rd, 1912, several lives were unexpectedly changed forever, and it's important that these individuals are remembered. These victims were everyday people like you and I, but families that were simply in the wrong place and at the wrong time. They deserve to be treated with respect, and hopefully they're all now at peace. Well, that concludes this month's episode of the C-Bus Paranormal Paracast. I hope that today's episode laid all of the murky details of this event to rest, and I hope that the poor souls that perished from this tragedy are at peace. They're certainly not forgotten, and hopefully with time a physical memorial will be created in their memory. And for our listeners, if you liked today's show, please share it with your friends and family, and consider rating it on your favorite podcasting platforms. It certainly helps to expand our audience and to get the show more visibility. As I previously mentioned, next month's episode will be a Q&A episode of the Paracast. So again, please make sure to get your questions into me, and I'll do my best to get everybody's questions on the air. Feel free to send your questions to me on social media or through the contact form on cbusparanormal.com. As always, thank you for listening, and we'll meet again next month. Thank you for listening.